At his age, all he wanted was a quiet job, a warm dog at his feet, and a small town that never changed. But the morning this old veteran unlocked the warehouse at dawn, he found the papers that proved someone was about to steal every farm in the valley. With nothing but a scarred German shepherd and a stubborn faith that God still sees small places, he has to choose. Stay silent and watch his neighbors lose everything, or stand up and risk it all for them. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Wind came off the plains before sunrise, rattling the co-op warehouse's tin roof and pushing a low whistle through the loading dock like the town itself was trying to speak. Walter Briggs, 59, paused a moment under the eave to feel the cold through the red and black plaid of his shirt jacket. He looked like a man hewn from habit, medium tall but a little lean from the years, shoulders still square, gray at the temples where the barber kept it short, a close-cut beard that softened rather than hid the lines at his mouth. The cream t-shirt at his collarbone caught the early light. His dark jeans showed a paler wash at the knees. The brown boots, carefully cleaned, wore the honest scuffs of long service. On his left wrist, the old military watch glinted, an hour hand slow as winter. He let himself into the warehouse the way he did everything else, quietly, as if not to disturb, then breathed in the faithful smells of rope, grain, oil, and dust that made a place feel like work and not worry. Outside, the town was already carrying a rumor, a development company offering good money to help folks move forward, the kind of talk that lands in a kitchen like a draft you can't find the crack for. Walter didn't do speeches, and he didn't do crowds. He did keys, logs, and the comfort of things he could square with a pencil and a steady hand. The board had asked him to mind a set of valuation files, the paperwork farmers needed to defend what their fields were worth. He thought of kitchen tables, envelopes under sugar bowls, hands that shook when they signed. He thought, not for the first time, how paper could feel heavier than steel. He set the ledger on the counter and opened it to the week's entries. The paper was cool. The ink sat faintly shiny where yesterday's pen had pressed too hard. At first glance, everything looked obedient. Columns marching, numbers lining up, signatures pinned like butterflies. But an old reflex stirred. Years since he'd run rescue grids under bad skies and learned how danger likes to hide in neatness. He leaned closer. A page that should have been second was fourth. The staple holes didn't line up. Someone had turned the order into a suggestion, then put it back tidy as a hymn. He checked initials. A J became a T between copies. A parcel acreage slipped a decimal the way a foot can slide on black ice. On a separate folder, he saw the stock of the paper change. Same form, different batch. As if a stranger had inserted a leaf through the stack and hoped the eye would accept it as kin. He closed his eyes for a breath, and there it was again. The old ache that visited in quiet rooms. The memory of a night far away when he'd arrived 1 minute too late and learned how a minute can be a lifetime. It had taught him to read edges and listen to silences. Now the silence here told him somebody had been inside the lines. He pictured the town's lean faces at Sunday potlucks, the way the older ones kept their coats on as if any moment might require rising. People didn't need a hero. They needed someone who didn't turn away. So he did what he knew. Checked the chain of custody log, ran his fingertip along the cardboard lip of the box where a new crease had formed, noted a faint crescent of grit that didn't come from grain. Maybe parking lot dust, not the alley's finer powder. He didn't jump to conclusions. He wrote down questions. Who had access to the file room after hours? Which signatures tended to appear near adjustments downward, never upward? How often did the same pen ink two different hands? The wind worried the door again, a gentle shoulder. He thought of the development men and their smooth boots, promising exits that didn't look like leaving. He thought of the way fear can loosen a person's hold on home. A man can't mend every hurt, he told himself, but he can hold a line and say, not this way. He straightened the ledger, the buffalo plaid at his shoulders catching a gust like a small sail, and tucked the altered pages back in the sequence they should have kept. Not to hide them, but to feel the rightness of order before he set about proving what had been wronged. He wasn't angry. He was steady. That, he knew, was a kind of mercy, too. He locked the drawer, tested it twice, and listened to the building settle. The warehouse breathed with him, a tired old animal that still had work left, and he let his hand rest on the counter as if to promise it would not be left alone. Then, in the hush that follows a decision, he let the question rise and live where it would prod him forward. Who had reached into this quiet place and moved the lines that decide a family's future? The altered pages stayed at the back of Walter's mind like a low ache as the morning stretched into its quieter hour. The one when the warehouse had been checked, swept, and settled, and all that remained was to keep watch over what most folks never thought about twice. The click of claws on concrete announced Ranger before the dog appeared, slipping through the open side door with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. The German shepherd was 7 by the vet's reckoning, in that solid middle age where muscle still answered, but the eyes had learned patience. His coat ran black along the back, tan at the legs and face, with a couple of pale scars tracing small white commas near one ear and along his flank, souvenirs of a life that had not been gentle from the start. The leather collar at his neck was plain brown, worn soft where Walter's fingers often rested. Ranger trotted straight to him, gave one quick, soft huff of greeting, then went to work without being told. He moved aisle to aisle, nose low, sniffing along pallets of seed and fertilizer, pausing at the file room door, then circling back to the loading dock, as if running a route he'd drawn in his own head. Walter watched him with a faint smile that didn't quite reach the deeper lines around his eyes. There was comfort in the way the dog checked the shadows, in how he sat finally at Walter's left side, angled so he could see both the office and the back entrance. The world might decide it was safe or not, but Ranger would make his own assessment. "You see it too, don't you?" Walter murmured, fingers brushing the fur behind one ear. "Something's off." Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his ears flicked toward the rear of the building, then relaxed, as if filing a note Walter couldn't read yet. For a few blessed minutes, the rhythm of small tasks took over. Stamping dates, answering a brief phone call about delivery times, signing off on a crate inventory. It was the kind of morning he knew how to carry, one page at a time. The bell over the front door chimed, thin but insistent. Ranger rose without a sound and moved ahead of Walter, not aggressive, just there, between. On the threshold stood an older woman in her late 70s, maybe early 80s. Her frame narrow inside a faded green cardigan that hung a little loose, like it had once belonged to someone broader. She had a long, fine-boned face with soft wrinkles around the mouth and eyes. Hair the color of snow pulled back into a bun that had lost part of its tightness during the walk. A wisp escaping over her forehead. One hand gripped the handle of a worn canvas tote. The other rested lightly on the elbow of the girl beside her, more for reassurance than support. The girl looked 15 or 16, all sharp elbows and long legs, in jeans that had seen barn mud, a flannel shirt tied around her waist, and a plain t-shirt with a school mascot cracking at the ink. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and her face held that fierce, frightened defiance particular to someone old enough to understand trouble, but young enough to feel it's unfair. "It's come so soon." "Morning, Mrs. Stein," Walter said, recognizing the older woman from church suppers and co-op meetings, where she mostly listened and seldom spoke. Her name was Ruth, he recalled now, a widow who ran a small dairy with her son until the son's heart had given out too early, leaving her and the girl to keep things going as best they could. "Morning, Walter," she answered, voice thin but still carrying a trace of the steel that had probably held Field and family together for decades. "We're not taking too much of your time, I hope." The girl's gaze had been on Ranger, watching the way his tail made a slow, measuring sweep, how he sat but kept his weight just forward enough to rise if he had to. "He's okay," Walter told her. "Name's Ranger. He just likes to know who's who." She reached out cautiously, letting the dog sniff her hand. When Ranger's tongue flicked once across her knuckles, something loosened in her shoulders. "Hi, Ranger," she said. Her voice was lighter than her eyes. "I'm Lily." Ranger leaned gently into her touch, granting her a small, wordless welcome. And in that contact, Walter saw a bridge lower between the hard things she carried and the room they now stood in. Ruth shifted the tote, nodding toward the office. "We heard some talk," she began, choosing each word like it might cut if dropped wrong. "About those men from the company, saying the land out by the creek's not worth much now. Too many years of the same rows, ground worn out. They say we'd be better off taking what's offered before the bank takes the rest." Lily stared at the floor, jaw tight. "Is that true?" Walter felt all the air in the room slow. He knew their place. A modest spread, cows in good condition, fences that didn't sag. The creek might run lower some summers, but the soil still held what it could with the right care. He thought of the shuffled pages, the moved decimals. "Where'd you hear that?" he asked, not unkindly. Ruth gave a small shrug. "Fellow at the feed store. Said he'd seen some papers. Said folks like us shouldn't get stubborn, or we'd lose what little we had left." It got the girl worried. Lily looked up then, anger and fear flashing together. "Grandma's tired, Mr. Briggs. We can't start over somewhere else. This is home. Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together until they steadied. "I just need to know if they're telling the truth about our land being worthless." Ranger gave a low whine, almost too quiet to hear, and moved closer to them, nudging his head lightly under Ruth's free hand, as if insisting she not carry her worry alone. Walter watched that small gesture and felt something inside him answer. He wasn't the kind of man to promise what he couldn't deliver, but he also knew what it did to a person to be told the ground under their feet didn't count. He came around the counter, so there was no barrier between them. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in Ruth's fingers, the way Lily leaned slightly toward her without realizing it. 2 generations trying to brace each other against a wind they couldn't see. "Ruth," he said softly, "paper can say a lot of things. Sometimes it tells the truth. Sometimes it tells whatever someone paid it to. Your land has fed families longer than those company men have probably been alive. That doesn't turn to nothing because they say a word like barren on a form." Lily's eyes searched his face, testing for platitudes. "So, what do we do?" she asked. "Wait for them to show up with a clipboard and a smile?" Outside, tires hummed on asphalt, then slowed. Ranger's head snapped toward the front windows, ears pricked. A pickup truck Walter didn't recognize rolled by, moving just a little under the speed limit. Driver a dark shape behind the glass. The truck lingered in front of the warehouse longer than any passing vehicle needed to, then eased on. But Ranger's reaction said more than the anonymous metal did. A low, controlled growl rose in his throat, not loud, but certain, his body placed neatly between the steins and the nearest line of sight from the road. Walter felt the hair lift along his own arms in a silent echo. Someone was watching. "That's enough," he murmured, laying a steadying hand on Ranger's shoulder. The growl faded to a rumble, then to silence, though the dog's eyes stayed fixed on the retreating truck until it turned the corner. He turned back to Ruth and Lily, choosing his words like a man stacking sandbags against a rising creek. "I'm not going to let anybody push you off that place with scare talk," he said. "These valuation files—" He tipped his head toward the office, not wanting to drag them into details they didn't need to hold. "They're meant to protect you, not sell you out. I've seen enough this morning to know I need to look harder. I will. I'll find out who's been saying what on paper about your land, and why." Ruth blinked, and for a moment her years showed all at once, a tiredness that went deeper than bone. "You can't be everywhere, Walter," she said. "You've done your share already." He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "Maybe I can't be everywhere," he agreed, "but I'm right here. And as long as I'm looking after this place, I'm not going to stand by while someone quietly writes your home off the map." Lily reached down to scratch Ranger behind the ear again. His tail thumped once, twice, the sound soft as agreement. "So we just carry on?" she asked. "Milk the cows, mend the fences, pretend we don't hear the rumors?" "You carry on," Walter said. "You keep doing the work you've always done. Let me worry about the papers for now. And if anyone comes around telling you your ground is worthless, you send them to talk to me." The words felt heavier than they sounded, a promise hammered out on the anvil of everything he'd failed to save before. He knew he was just one man in a worn plaid jacket with a dog and a ring of keys, no title beyond keeper of the warehouse, no badge or bench to back his name. But he also knew what it meant, in a world that liked to count people out, for somebody to stand in a doorway and refuse to step aside. As Ruth nodded slowly and Lily's shoulders eased by a degree, Walter felt Ranger press closer to his leg, the dog's steady warmth like a hand at the small of his back, urging him to hold the line he'd just drawn with his own mouth. And he couldn't help but wonder, as the bell over the door chimed again behind them, whether that quiet promise would be enough when all he had to keep it with was his two empty hands and the dog at his heel. After the Steins left, the warehouse settled into a hush that made every small sound feel like a word spoken too loud. Walter stood for a moment with his hand resting on the doorframe, watching the street where the unfamiliar pickup had disappeared, feeling Ranger's steady weight leaning against his leg as if the dog were bracing him as much as he was bracing the door. The promise he'd just made hung in the air like condensation on cold glass, easy to see, harder to wipe away. He turned back inside, the red and black plaid of his jacket catching on a splintered edge of the desk. He eased it free with the same care he brought to everything these days, knowing how quickly small tears became big ones if you tugged. Work, he told himself. Start where the facts are. The sign-in log sat by the office window, a simple spiral-bound book with more power than it appeared to have, each line a record of who had come and gone. Walter flipped past his own neat handwriting from early morning toward the previous pages. Day shifts, deliveries, a repairman he remembered. Then his eye caught on a late-night entry. Ink a slightly different shade of blue, the handwriting small and tight as if afraid of itself. Badge number, time-stamped just after midnight. No full name, only a title written in block letters. Project Supervisor. His jaw tightened. There had been no scheduled work order for the night. He checked the pinned calendar, the clipboard of requests, his own memory. Nothing lined up with someone needing access at that hour. A vein of old training surfaced, the one that had taught him to look at what wasn't there as much as what was. On patrol overseas, they'd learned to read the absence of normal. No kids playing, No laundry hanging. One door closed when they were usually open. Here, the absence was honest names where they should be. Someone had come in under a role instead of a person. "You remember a project supervisor on the schedule, buddy?" he asked softly. Ranger, lying by the office chair, lifted his head, ears pricking at the change in Walter's tone. The dog didn't understand the words, but he heard the tension braided through them. He rose, paws clicking lightly, and came to stand beside the desk, nose skimming the edge of the logbook as if scent could tell him more than ink. A faint, metallic tang reached Walter's nose too, now that he was paying attention, cutting through the stored grain smell. A ghost of motor oil, the kind you'd pick up from someone who leaned into engines more than into soil. "Oil," he murmured. "From last night?" Ranger's tail gave one sharp tick toward the back of the building. Then he turned, padding away with purpose, glancing over his shoulder once to make sure Walter was following. "All right," Walter said, something like gratitude warming beneath the worry. "Lead on." They moved through the long central aisle, past pallets and stacked sacks, the overhead lights humming softly. Ranger's nose stayed low, tracking a path invisible to Walter's eyes, but clear as a painted line to the dog. The scent trail, whatever it was, grew stronger as they neared the file room, a smaller space off the main floor where the valuation documents lived in beige cabinets and bankers' boxes. The door was shut, as it should be, a key hanging from Walter's own belt. He unlocked it, felt again that small resistance a lock gives. The first time you turn it after someone else's hand has been there, whether you can prove it or not. Inside, the air was cooler, drier, the dust finer. Ranger went straight to the second row of shelves, to a middle-level box with a printed label. Agricultural Land Valuations, Corridor A. He snuffled along its edge, then pushed his nose under one flap and gave a short, deliberate jerk of his head, sending a manila folder sliding out to flop onto the floor at Walter's boots. "That one, huh?" Walter knelt slowly, his knees complaining in a familiar way, and picked up the folder. The tab bore a date and a range of parcel numbers that made his stomach dip. They corresponded, he knew without needing to look it up, to the stretch of farms that lay along the rumored route for the new logistics project. The paper inside felt just like the rest, same weight, same town letterhead, but as he leafed through, the numbers told a different story. Assessed values marked down by 20–30%. Not in a straight line, which would have been too obvious, but here and there, like someone pruning branches, the cuts disguised among legitimate adjustments. For the Steins sector, a note in the margin read, "Soil degradation, diminished future yield," in a handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. Careful, cursive, the kind that had been taught in a classroom, not grown in the dust of a barn. Walter's breath went thin and shallow. He thought of Ruth's lined hands, Lily's jaw clenched against the thought of leaving home, the way rumor had reached them even before any official paper did. In other places, long ago, he had seen the pattern. First, you soften the target with stories, whispers, doubts, so that when the real blow falls, people are too worn down to resist. He remembered maps spread out under field lamps, circles drawn around villages, someone calling it shaping the battle space, as if the land and the lives on it were made of clay instead of roots and years. "Same dance," he muttered, not sure if he was talking to Ranger or the ghosts. "Different floor." Ranger leaned closer, nose hovering over the phrases on the page, as if he too could smell the wrongness in the ink. Walter closed the folder, not to hide it, but to contain the tremor he felt in his own fingers. There was anger there, yes, but deeper than that was a weariness of seeing ordinary people turned into someone else's stepping stones. He slid the folder back into the box, this time upright and marked in his mind. Then he pulled another and another, sampling just enough to confirm the pattern without getting lost in the details. Along corridor A, values trended down. Farther out, in parcels less crucial to any proposed route, numbers stayed mostly steady. It was like watching a shadow move across a map. He backed up, sat on the low stool by the shelves, and rubbed both hands over his face, feeling the roughness of beard and the smoothness of the old watch band beneath his wrist. He was just the keeper of the warehouse, a man with keys and a check-in sheet. Not an attorney or an elected official. But the files were under his roof. That meant something. "We can't sit on this, boy," he said quietly. "Not and look them in the eye on Sunday." The thought of standing up in front of the farmers that evening, of stepping to the front of the metal folding chairs at the Grange Hall and saying out loud what he'd seen, tightened his chest more than any firefight ever had. Combat had rules of engagement, commands, a chain of command. This was softer, slipperier, like trying to grab smoke. He pictured the board members, men and women he'd known for years, some longer than that. Somewhere along the way, at least one of them had given a stranger's badge access to the building. Somewhere someone he shook hands with had decided a title, project supervisor, could stand in for a name. "Who let them in?" he whispered, the question more to himself than to Ranger. "Who's smiling on both sides of the table?" Ranger rested his chin lightly on Walter's knee, the warmth of his muzzle an anchor. The dog didn't know about boards or corridors or assessed values. He knew his person was troubled, and that when a pack member was troubled, you stayed close. Walter let one hand drift to the dog's head, fingers tracing the familiar path between the ears, feeling his pulse steady to match the quiet, patient beat of Ranger's breathing. Practical steps, he told himself. First, copy what can vanish. He rose and gathered the relevant folders, careful to keep them in order, carrying them to the small copier in the office. The machine was old, like most things in town, but it hummed to life obediently. Light bar sliding left and right, spitting out duplicates that he stacked with almost reverent care. Each sheet felt like a small shield he was forging. Not much on its own, but maybe, together, enough to hold for a while. He labeled the copies with dates, slid them into a separate envelope, and tucked that into a locked drawer that didn't share a key with the file room. Then he went back to the log and traced the line of that midnight entry again. The lonely project supervisor standing like a lie in a crowd of true names. The farmers would be gathering tonight, same as they always did when something big loomed on the horizon. Boots shuffled under chairs, caps turned in nervous fingers, the smell of coffee too weak and cookies too dry on folding tables at the back. He would have to look up and speak. Breaking the habit of a lifetime that preferred the edges of rooms. He would have to tell them that the numbers they trusted were being bent, that someone close enough to have keys was helping. His reflection in the office window looked older than he felt, and yet somehow less finished than he hoped to be by now. The scars the world had left on him didn't show the way Ranger's did, but they tugged in familiar ways all the same. "They deserve to know," he said, out loud this time, as if the walls needed convincing as much as he did. Ranger answered with a single, quiet wag of his tail and that steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to say the only thing a dog ever really says. "I'm here." Walter closed the logbook, the decision settling in his chest with the weight of something irrevocable. And as he slid it back into its drawer, he felt the unease stir again. Not about whether to speak, but about who in the circle he was walking into had already chosen to stand on the other side of the line he was about to draw. By the time evening slid down over town, the church hall smelled of folding chairs, percolated coffee, and rain that hadn't quite committed to falling yet. Walter stood near the front, under the simple wooden cross and the yellowed acoustic tiles, adjusting the collar of his cream t-shirt where it peeked out from the red and black plaid. Ranger lay at his heels, front paws crossed, eyes half-lidded but never really asleep, tracking each new pair of boots that clattered in. The farmers came in twos and threes, hats in hand, faces browned by weather and thinned by years of hard seasons. Murmurs rose and fell like a low tide. Talk of offers, of banks, of that new company with its glossy brochures. Walter's envelope of copied valuations sat on the folding table beside him, heavier to his mind than any rifle he'd ever had to carry. His stomach felt the way it had before night operations overseas. Tight, hollow, aware that once you stepped off, there was no such thing as undoing the first move. Only this time there were no helmets, no flares, just neighbors and fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly. He looked down at Ranger. "We'll keep it simple," he whispered. "Just the truth." Ranger's tail thumped once, a quiet vote of confidence from a creature who had no use for spin. The hall lights flickered then, a brief shiver, and someone in the back said, "Storm's coming after all." The next second, everything went black. The hum cut off. The exit signs glowed red but dim. A soft, surprised silence settled, broken by a couple of nervous laughs and one muttered curse. Walter's heart gave a hard, old-fashioned jolt. Power went out sometimes in town, sure, but the timing scraped against the raw edge of what he discovered that morning. He heard Ranger rise in the dark, felt the dog's shoulder bump his leg, a warm, solid point in the sudden void. Somewhere to his right, the pastor, a man in his 60s with a round, kind face and thin gray hair, said, "Must be the line out by the mill again. Everyone stay put a minute, we'll check the breakers." Walter might have believed that on another night. Tonight, something in the air felt off-kilter, like a picture hanging just crooked enough to bother you. Then he heard it. A metallic rattle from the back of the building, near the service entrance, followed by the dull thud of weight hitting a door that wasn't meant to be used during meetings. Ranger stiffened, head snapping toward the sound, a low growl rising from deep in his chest. "Stay calm," Walter said quietly to no one and everyone, as his hand went to the flashlight on the table. He clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dark toward the side hallway. Shapes huddled in the overflow chairs, faces turned like flowers toward the sudden light. "I'll take a look," he told the pastor, who started to protest, but saw something in Walter's expression that made him simply nod. "Take him," the older man whispered, chin jerking toward Ranger. "He sees better than I do." In the hallway, the air felt colder, the linoleum under Walter's boots echoing differently than the carpeted hall. The service door at the very back shuddered in its frame, someone outside testing the handle, then putting a shoulder into it in a deliberate, measured way. Not a panicked parent late to a meeting, not a gust of storm wind. Ranger surged ahead until Walter's soft heel brought him back to his side, though the dog's body remained coiled, ready. The silhouette of the door's small window was just a darker rectangle in the dark. Another thud, this one accompanied by the scrape of a boot. Walter swallowed, anger and an old, unwelcome fear mixing in his throat. He'd seen doors like this give way under pressure, seen what waited on the other side when men believed they owned the right to come in. "Church is closed," he called, voice steady, if not loud. "Meeting's already underway." A man's voice came through the door, muffled by wood and weather stripping, low and strained. "We just need a word, Mr. Briggs. Won't take a minute." He didn't recognize it, which told him enough. "You can wait till morning like everyone else," Walter answered. Ranger moved now, planting himself directly between Walter and the door, head lowered, teeth just visible as that growl deepened. A hard slam hit the latch, metal complaining. Someone outside hissed, "Harder!" The wood creaked. Walter's pulse thudded in his ears. He could feel, more than hear, the restless shifting of people back in the hall, sensed questions beginning to form. He didn't want panic. He wanted witnesses. And he wanted whoever was out there to know they weren't just shoving one quiet man around. On the wall to his left, near the coat hooks, hung a relic almost everyone had forgotten except him. The old battery-powered warehouse alarm horn he donated years ago when the co-op upgraded. It was wired through a simple switch to a deep-cell battery, just in case of emergencies during events. Hailstorms, fires, tornadoes. That was what they'd had in mind. He reached for it now, fingers brushing the dust on the casing, and flipped the switch. The horn's shriek tore through the night, startling even him. A long, insistent wail that cut through the church hall, out into the streets, over the low roofs of the town, like a cry they hadn't heard since the mill fire 20 years back. Ranger barked once, sharp and authoritative, the sound punching through the horn's wail. And somewhere in the main hall someone yelled, "What's happening?" There wasn't time to answer. The doorframe shuddered again as one of the men outside threw his full weight at it. The latch groaned, metal beginning to bend. But the hinges held, for now. Walter set his shoulder to the inside, boots braced, feeling each impact all the way through his spine. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath, more prayer than threat. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A lanky boy of about 13, maybe 14, hovering at the edge of the hallway's light. It was Sam Carter, the paper boy who'd taken over his route from an older brother. All knees and elbows, light brown hair sticking up in nervous spikes, blue eyes wide but not empty. He'd slipped away from the adults, curiosity and worry pulling him toward the noise. "Mr. Briggs?" Sam's voice cracked just a little. "What do you need?" Walter held the door with both hands now, feeling the push and pull in his aging shoulders, and made a choice in the space of a heartbeat. "You see that black pouch on the table by the front?" he asked, forcing the words out evenly. "The one I brought in with me?" "Yeah," Sam said. "Grab it. There's a USB drive inside. I need you to run it up to Main Street, straight to the station or the diner, whichever's more lit up right now. Tell whoever's there it needs to go in a safe tonight. You don't stop for anybody calls you by name on the way. You hear me?" Another slam rocked the door. Ranger launched up, paws on the lower panel, teeth bared, barking now in measured bursts that were as much warning as they were defiance. On the other side, Walter heard a curse, a second voice saying, "Dogs in there," laced with annoyance rather than fear, as if they hadn't planned on this extra variable. Sam hesitated only a fraction of a second, just long enough for Walter to see the boy's throat work, to see a decision harden in him. "Yes, sir," he said. The "sir" wasn't military. It was the plain respect of a kid who'd seen this man fix a flat for his grandma in the grocery parking lot without making a fuss. He darted past Ranger, who swung his head just enough to scent him, then let him go with a short bark, almost like an order. "Move." In the stuttering flashes of battery lanterns and cell phone lights in the main hall, Walter saw Sam scoop up the pouch, clutch it to his chest, and slip out through the side aisle toward the front doors, weaving between chairs with the natural grace of someone used to dodging puddles on a morning route. Another body hit the back door from outside, frustration fraying into anger now. "Open up, old man," the first voice snarled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Walter leaned in, feeling the roughness of the wood under his palms, the strain in his knees as he held his ground. His mind flickered for an instant to an image of himself years ago in another doorway. The night he'd been too slow, the sirens too late. The ghost of that failure had lived in his chest ever since, like a stone he couldn't quite cough up. Tonight, with nothing but his boots, his battered jacket, and a dog between him and history, he felt that stone shift. "You picked the wrong door," he said quietly. Not a threat, just a statement of fact from a man who had run out of room to back up. The horn continued to wail, a mechanical howl that told the town something was wrong at the church. Footsteps pounded in the hall now, more than one set. Men and women coming to see or to stand, or at least to understand. Flashlight beams began to converge at the end of the corridor, cutting stripes across the dark. Some hit the back door from inside, others swept the small window. One of them caught, for a heartbeat, the face of the nearer intruder through the glass. Maybe mid-30s, square jaw, close-cropped dark hair. Eyes flat and impatient. A stranger's features that belonged to no family Walter knew. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. Two men taking the other's measure through a sheet of smudged safety glass. The stranger's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. He stepped back, the pressure on the door easing. A hand thumped the panel once, almost companionably, as if this had been a test neither of them would admit out loud. Then the voice came, clearer now that he'd moved closer to the window. "You don't know who you're up against, Mr. Briggs," he said. "And you sure as hell don't know how far this goes." Walter held his gaze, saying nothing, feeling Ranger's heartbeat through the door where the dog still pressed his weight. Shouts rose from the parking lot as more townspeople arrived, tires crunching gravel, car lights flaring. The two silhouettes outside turned and melted into the deeper dark beyond the spill of headlights. The door, freed of their assault, sagged back into its frame with a tired sigh. Someone behind Walter exhaled shakily. Ranger dropped back to all fours, but he didn't move away from the door, staring after the men with that unwavering focus that said he'd logged their scent, their sound, their threat. Walter's own breathing was loud in his ears, his hands tingling where they'd gripped the wood. The horn's alarm finally cut off as someone found the switch back in the hall, leaving a ringing quiet in its place. People would have questions now about what had happened, about what was worth breaking doors for, about the USB now speeding up the street in a boy's fist. But for the first time in a long while, as he stood in that dim corridor with Ranger at his side and the town answering an alarm he'd dared to sound, Walter felt less like a man haunted by an old failure and more like someone standing, however shakily, at the very start of something that might yet ask a higher price than he knew how to count. By late morning the next day, the sky over town had settled into that flat, bright gray that made everything look like it had been pressed under glass. Walter stood on the courthouse steps with Ranger at his side, the dog's fur warm against his jeans as people filed past them into the council chamber. His red and black jacket felt almost too loud for the room he was about to walk into. All polished wood and neutral carpet meant to make hard decisions look tidy. Inside, the usual folding chairs had been replaced by the town's better seats. Rows of them facing a long table where three strangers in suits sat like an answer someone else had already written. The one in the middle was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-featured, with a sleek, dark bind glasses that caught the overhead light. Her navy blazer sat perfectly on her shoulders. No lint, no dog hair, no sign she had ever leaned against a fence post. On her right, a man around 35 with a gym-hardened build and a clean-shaven square jaw paged through a leather folio, his short dark hair combed in decisive lines. On her left sat another man, a little older, maybe early 40s, leaner, with close-cropped sandy hair and a face that seemed to hold its expressions somewhere behind the eyes, rather than on the surface. A black briefcase rested by his chair, expensive leather with a polished clasp. Even from the aisle, Walter could smell the faint mix of motor oil and cold metal that clung to it. The same note that had hung in the church hallway under the siren's wail. Ranger smelled it too. The dog was moving easily at heel until they reached the back of the chamber. There, his steps shortened, claws pausing mid-stride as his nose lifted, nostrils flaring. He focused, not on the people at the table, but on the black case, eyes narrowing. A soft, repeated huff came from his chest, not quite a growl, but not contentment either. Walter laid a quiet hand on his neck. "I know," he murmured. "I remember." The room filled slowly. The Steins, Ruth and Lily, taking seats together near the middle. Mrs. Jenkins from the bakery, the pastor, a scattering of other farmers he'd seen leaning over coffee at the diner that morning, faces drawn into careful blankness. The town council members settled into their usual places along the side, trying hard to look neutral and not quite managing it. When everyone had shuffled and coughed themselves into something like readiness, the woman in the navy blazer stood. "Good morning," she began, her voice smooth as the folder she held. "I'm Karen Holt, Regional Liaison for North Corridor Development. We appreciate you all coming on such short notice so we can clear up some misunderstandings." The word misunderstandings slid over the room like a polite slap. Walter sat toward the back but near the aisle, where he could see both the table and the faces of the people listening. Ranger lay down with his front paws stretched, head up, gaze fixed on the briefcase. Holt clicked a remote, and the projector on the ceiling hummed to life, throwing a crisp map onto the screen at the front. The valley from above, the town a pale knot. The farm plots shaded in soft colors. "We're here to talk about opportunity," she said. "The opportunity to bring new jobs and stability to this area by building a logistics hub that will put your town on the map in a new way. For that, we need to acquire certain parcels of land. And I want to reassure you that we are offering compensation well above typical market value for rural acreage of this kind." She clicked again. Numbers appeared at the bottom of the slide, rows and columns with dollar signs. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Some of the figures did look big to eyes used to small margins. Walter felt his own heartbeat slow, the way it did when he needed to tune out noise and listen for a different kind of signal. He pulled the envelope of copies from inside his jacket, the paper crackling faintly, and flipped it open on his lap. While Holt talked, he traced the parcel numbers as they appeared on the screen, matching them to the ones in his hands. The values listed up there were higher than the doctored valuations he'd found, but only just enough to feel generous without reaching the true worth. At the bottom corner of each slide, in tiny gray type, was a timestamp. Last revision, followed by a date and time. To most eyes, just digital housekeeping. To Walter, whose memory still stored the logbook's jagged midnight entry like a photograph, those numbers stood out like flares. Last revision, 12:17 a.m. Last revision, 12:19 a.m. The same window of time someone with a project supervisor badge had slipped into his warehouse. His thumb pressed hard into the paper until the edge dug into his skin. Next to him, Ranger's breathing had changed, slightly faster, his focus unblinking. The sandy-haired man with the briefcase, Holt had introduced him in passing as Mr. Drake, our project advisor, shifted in his chair, reaching down once to touch the case, as if to reassure himself it was still there. The movement released another faint thread of that oil and metal smell. Ranger's nose wrinkled. He gave a short, insistent snort and looked up at Walter, then back at the case, and back again. A dog's version of pointing. Walter felt a grim, quiet confirmation settle in. The world might call it coincidence, but his dog didn't believe in those. At the front, Holt was saying, and for families like the Steins, whose land near the creek has suffered from years of overuse, we're prepared to offer a package that accounts for diminished yield and the cost of relocation. All eyes swung, as if on hinges, to Ruth. The older woman straightened in her seat as if a string had been tugged in her spine. She looked smaller in this room than she had in Walter's warehouse, swallowed by the high ceiling and the authority of microphones, but her hands rested steady on the purse in her lap. Lily sat on her right, shoulders tight, the faint wheeze in her breath that Walter had only noticed in passing, now more obvious in the hush. Diminished yield? Ruth repeated, her voice thin but clear. Is that what you call it? When the creek runs lower because somebody upstream diverted water for their plant? Is that what you call it when we stretch every bale and still keep the cows in good flesh? She paused, swallowing. The faint tremor in her fingers became visible as she reached to pat Lily's knee. We sell. We don't just lose fields and a barn. We lose the only place where I can keep an eye on this girl when her chest tightens in the night. You going to come out to some apartment complex and listen to her wheeze through your bonus? A murmur, half sympathy, half uncomfortable laughter, moved through the room. Holt's mouth pressed into a line that might have been pity or annoyance or both. Ma'am, she said, no one is minimizing your hard work. We're simply recognizing the economic reality of your situation. Our offers will give you the means to seek better medical care, better housing, and leave the graves of my husband and son on land you've marked as corridor in yellow? Ruth asked. Her voice shook now, with anger more than fear. You call that better? Walter watched the exchange with a knot in his chest. He wanted, with a sudden, almost painful urgency, to step up, to hold the maps next to the copies and show the room exactly how the dates lined up, how the numbers had been bent like saplings in somebody else's wind. Yet the memory of the men at the church door, of the hissed, you don't know who you're up against, pressed against his ribs. He was at heart a man who preferred back doors and quiet fixes, not microphones. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his flank against Walter's boot as if to push him up out of his chair. The dog's eyes held that steady, uncomplicated certainty that had pulled him through darker nights than this. The air in the chamber thickened. Everyone suspended between the sweetness of the figures on the screen and the sour taste of what it might cost. The council members glanced at one another, at Holt, at the crowd, weighing risk and relief. Holt let the silence breathe just long enough for desperation to start working on people, then lifted her hands in a small, appeasing gesture. We don't want anyone to feel pressured, she said. Take your time, consider your options, but this is frankly more generous than what some communities are offered. Turning it down. She let the sentence drift, implication doing the last few steps by itself. Walter looked down at the envelope in his hands, at the precise, incriminating timestamps, at the dog who had recognized a scent and refused to forget it. In front of him, Ruth's shoulders shook once, almost imperceptibly, and Lily's hand closed around her grandmother's, knuckles white. The question rose inside him like something with its own pulse. Swallow the lie and hope to salvage pieces later, or stand up here and now in this room and lay bare what he'd seen, no matter who at that table had already chosen their side. And as Ranger's breath warmed the back of his hand, Walter wondered which would cost this town more, his silence or his voice. For a long breath after Ruth's words faded, no one spoke. The map glowed on the wall, bright and bloodless. As if nothing real could ever be hurt by what it showed, Walter felt Ranger's weight against his boot, the envelope in his hands, the familiar itch at his scar, where old shrapnel and weather liked to argue. He heard his own voice in his head offering the easy way out. Let someone else do this. Let the numbers slide. But over it came Lily's wheeze, Ruth's trembling hand, the siren last night, and the quiet, stubborn faith of a dog who kept pointing at the same wrong smell. He cleared his throat. "Madam Chair," he said, using the councilwoman's title because the room needed formality to stand on. "If I could have a minute." Every head near him turned in mild surprise. Walter Briggs did not usually ask for minutes. At the front, the council chair, a woman in her early 60s with a compact frame, short silver hair, and a face lined by years of PTA meetings and budget fights, glanced between him and Holt. Then she nodded once. "You've got it, Walter," she said. "Keep it to the point." He rose, joints protesting, the red and black plaid suddenly feeling like a flag he hadn't meant to raise. Ranger rose too, as if connected by an invisible string. Walter walked down the aisle, boots soft on the carpet, the envelope held like something humble rather than heroic. When he reached the projector table, he set the envelope down and looked up at the map. "You've all seen this picture," he began, voice low but carried by the room's quiet. "I'd like you to see the other side of it." With the council chair's small gesture of assent, he reached for the laptop connected to the projector. The USB Sam had carried to Main Street the night before had done its job. A copy of the scanned valuation sheets waited in a folder labeled in the clerk's careful script. Walter opened it, clicked a file, and replaced Holt's gleaming color map with a plain black and white page. Parcel numbers in a neat column, assessed values in another, a last revision timestamp at the bottom. "These are copies of the land valuations we keep at the co-op warehouse," he said. "Or we thought we kept them." He tapped a key, bringing up another version of the same sheet. This one with numbers nudged downward, the same parcels shaded on Holt's map. "This is what I found after someone with a temporary badge came in around midnight the other night. You'll notice the adjustments mostly hit the properties lining up with that yellow corridor you saw earlier." A murmur moved through the farmers, sharper this time. He zoomed in on the tiny gray text at the bottom. "Now, I'm no computer man, but even I know last revisions shouldn't suddenly move to 12-something in the morning if nobody's supposed to be working then. These files weren't just updated. They were prepared to make a low offer look high." Behind him, Holt shifted in her heels. "Mr. Briggs," she said, a note of warning creeping in, "those are internal working drafts. You may be misinterpreting." "Maybe I am," Walter agreed, not looking back at her just yet. "That's why I brought them out in the open, so we can all misinterpret them together." A ripple of strained laughter broke some of the tension, enough to let him breathe. Ranger had inched forward with him and now stood almost level with the table where Holt and her two colleagues sat. The dog's nose twitched, drawn again and again to the black briefcase by Mr. Drake's chair. The advisor shifted his leg as if to shield it, his jaw tightening. "Call off your dog," he muttered under his breath. "He's fine," Walter replied, still facing the screen. "He just recognizes things." As if on cue, Ranger stepped closer, sniffed once more, then hooked his muzzle firmly through the loop of the case's handle and gave it a decisive tug. The movement surprised Drake, who had one hand on the case. His fingers slipped, the latch popped, and the briefcase tumbled to the carpet, spilling its contents in an undignified fan at Holt's polished shoes. A slim remote key fob skittered toward the center aisle, its plastic casing nicked from use. A laminated temporary access badge, clipped to a retractable reel, slid free and spun once on its edge before settling face up. Project Supervisor. Temporary. The company logo at the top, last night's date printed at the bottom. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Ranger backed off just enough to stand between the scattered items, and Drake, hackles only slightly raised, tail level. A herding stance, not a hunting one. Walter stared at the badge, at the key fob, at the faint smear of dark residue on the plastic. He could smell it now that it was loose from the leather. Motor oil and cold metal, same as in the file room and the church hall. The connections lined themselves up in his mind, simple as fence posts. "Looks like your project supervisor worked some overtime," he said quietly. His voice didn't swell. If anything, it flattened, the way his words did when he'd seen something too obvious to dress up. Drake lurched forward, face flushing, hands shooting out toward the badge. "That's company property," he snapped. "Your dog just destroyed—" A heavy, slower movement cut across his words. From the side of the room, the sheriff rose. He was in his late 50s, thick through the middle in the way of a man who'd traded field work for paperwork but still wore his duty on his shoulders. His thinning light brown hair was combed back, his square face usually softened by a ready half-smile. But there was nothing soft in it now. Deep lines framed his mouth, and his gray eyes had gone the color of an approaching storm. "Hold up, Mr. Drake," Sheriff Nolan said, voice calm but edgy. "Let's all see what we've got before anything gets picked up." He walked down the aisle with unhurried steps that somehow moved faster than anyone else's panic, pausing only to murmur, "Easy, boy," to Ranger, whose ears flicked but whose feet stayed planted. Then he bent, picked up the key fob and the badge with 2 fingers, and turned them so the room could see. "Funny thing," he said. "We had a report of someone using a temp credential at the co-op after hours. And now here it is, tumbling out on the floor after a dog that's never lied about a scent decides he doesn't like your luggage." Holt's composure showed its first real crack. She reached for the briefcase, stacking papers with clipped motion, but her eyes tracked the badge like it might explode. "Sheriff, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation," she began. "Our internal security—" "Internal can wait," Nolan said. He straightened, tucking the badge and fob into an evidence envelope the clerk handed him with shaking hands. "Until we sort out why your folks needed into the warehouse without clearance, I'm ordering all related documents held. Town records, co-op records, your company's offers. Nobody signs anything. Nobody moves anything until we've had a look with more than your word to go on." He turned to the council chair. "Madam Chair, I'd like your formal motion to secure those files." The chair, who had been gripping her pen so hard her knuckles whitened, let out a breath. "You have it," she said. "Clerk will note it. All in favor?" Hands rose around the horseshoe of the council table, some hesitant, some quick. Holt's protest died on her tongue as she realized she no longer owned the room. Walter stood a little to the side, feeling strangely outside his own body, as if watching a scene he'd set in motion but never meant to star in. Ranger, finished with his part, pressed against his leg again, looking up with a dog's simple question. "We did what we could." Drake, seeing the tide turn, tried bluster as a last defense. "You people are throwing away a lifeline," he said, standing now, color high in his cheeks. "This project goes elsewhere, and you'll be left with nothing but your rusting tractors and unpaid bills." Walter stepped forward then, not to loom but to be seen. In the fluorescent light, his buffalo plaid jacket looked worn at the cuffs. The cream t-shirt at his throat smudged faintly with the day's worry. He did not lift his chin much, just enough to meet Drake's eyes on level ground. "This is our home," he said, voice quiet but carrying. "And whatever it's worth on your spreadsheet, the truth isn't something you get to bargain down." The words surprised him with their own steadiness, as if they'd been waiting for years behind all the things he hadn't said. Ruth made a small sound, half sob, half sigh, and someone in the back murmured, "Amen." Nolan nodded once, like a man ticking a box he'd hoped to check for a long time. He turned fully to Holt and Drake. "You heard him," the sheriff said. "For now, you and your folks sit tight. You'll have your chance to explain yourselves, in writing and under oath if need be. But you won't be doing any more quiet business at our back doors." The room's noise rose. Questions, relief, fear. The realization that a fight had just shifted from invisible to official. Walter let it wash over him, feeling both smaller and somehow lighter, as if a weight he'd carried alone had rolled a few inches onto broader shoulders. Ranger leaned into his knee, accepting a slow stroke along his head, and for the first time in a long time, the old veteran let himself wonder, very softly, very cautiously, whether this time, in this doorway, he had finally been able to hold the line he'd once lost, and whether that would be enough to keep this town and his own haunted heart from being claimed by someone else's price tag. A week later, the town woke to a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm has passed and people start noticing what's still standing. The courthouse bulletin board held a new notice, neat and official. The council's resolution canceling any prior understanding with North Corridor Development and authorizing legal action over fraudulent valuations. It wasn't a victory parade. There were no bands, no banners. But as farmers came and went from the post office and the feed store, shoulders seemed a little less hunched, conversations a little less hushed. Word spread that outside auditors were coming, that the land would be looked at again by people who weren't paid to see it as cheap. In the fine print, there was mention of a fund. Money carved from whatever settlement might come, to help families like the Steins who had been dangled over the edge first. Walter read the notice once, lips moving silently over the legal phrasing, then stepped back to let another pair of eyes take his place. Ranger sat at his heel, gaze flicking between his handler's face and the comings and goings on Main Street, as if counting who still belonged here. "Looks like we bought some time," Walter murmured. Ranger's tail gave a slow, contented sweep against the sidewalk, as if to say, "Time is something." By Saturday, the rescue squad's training field behind the fire station was awake with the sound of young voices and the clatter of metal ladders. The sky was a high, washed blue, the kind that made the red of Walter's plaid jacket stand out like a square of autumn in spring. He stood near a retired engine, its paint dulled, but its lines still proud, showing a cluster of teenagers how to coil hoses without tripping themselves. The squad captain, a woman in her late 30s with a strong, compact build, curly dark hair pulled through the back of a ball cap, and a face browned by 100 brush fires, had cornered him earlier in the week outside the diner. "You keep your head when things go sideways," she'd said, arms crossed but eyes kind. "Come down Saturday. Share some of that with the kids, if you've got it to spare." He'd almost said no out of habit. Instead, he'd heard himself answer, "I'll bring the dog. He's the brave one." Now Ranger lay in the shade of the engine, head resting squarely across Walter's well-worn brown boots, amber eyes tracking each kid who approached. Every time one of them mastered a knot or climbed down a ladder with less wobble than the time before, they drifted toward the dog as if drawn by gravity. Fingers reaching to scritch his ears, voices spilling thanks meant for both of them. "Mr. Briggs, Ranger's really something," one boy said. about 16, lanky with freckles and a mop of red hair, cheeks flushed from running drills. He didn't even flinch when the siren test went off. Walter's mouth tugged into the small, lopsided smile that felt more natural these days. "He's heard worse," he said. "So have I. That's why we're here, to make sure you only hear it in training, if we can help it." As he spoke, he realized the weight between his shoulder blades, the one he'd carried since the night he hadn't been fast enough, years and miles away, had shifted. It hadn't vanished. Ghosts rarely did. But it felt unbuckled, like a pack set down at the edge of a field, while a man stretched his back and watched younger legs take over the path. From the edge of the grass, Ruth Stein watched the practice for a moment. Cardigan buttoned wrong at the top, face soft with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, but sat comfortably between the two. Down the hill from the training field, at the farmer's market that popped up in the parking lot on weekends, a new stand had appeared. Someone had painted the sign by hand in a careful script. Stein Dairy, fresh milk and cream. Glass bottles, beaded with cold, stood in neat rows on a bed of chipped ice. Lily, in a faded blue sweatshirt, handled the cash box, her breath easy in the mild air as she laughed with two school friends about something small and silly. Every so often, Ruth would make her way back down to the stand, checking the cooler, straightening the sign, patting Lily's shoulder like she still needed to be sure the girl was real and rooted here, not drifting toward some nameless apartment above a strip mall 2 counties away. Walter and Ranger passed by the stall on their way home from training, the dog's nose twitching appreciatively at the scent of cream and hay. "We kept it," Ruth said when she saw them, chin lifting just a little. "The house, the barn, the creek. Didn't let them turn it yellow on any map." Walter nodded, eyes crinkling. "Always thought it looked better in green anyway," he said. Ranger stepped closer to the table, and Lily's hand found his head with the ease of long acquaintance, fingers sliding between his ears in a rhythm that made his eyes half close. For a brief moment, the 4 of them stood there. Old soldier, old woman, young girl, and dog. As if the market, the lawsuits, the maps, all of it had narrowed down to this. People staying where they belonged and making something from the milk of their own cows. The town's new sign went up a few days later at the west end of Main Street, near the grain elevator. Walter helped hoist it, the muscles in his arms complaining in familiar ways as he and 2 other men maneuvered the posts into place. The sign wasn't flashy, just white-painted wood with black letters that could be read from a pickup window or the cab of a tractor. "This land belongs to the ones who tend it." The wording had been debated for a good half hour at the cafe, argued over with sugar packets and coffee spoons. But when the final version went up, even the loudest talkers fell quiet for a second. Ranger sat in the dust beside the ladder, tongue lolling, tail sweeping lazy arcs as he watched his person work. When the bolts were tightened and the ladder carried away, Walter stepped back, wiping his hands on the thighs of his dark jeans, and just looked. The words weren't magic. He knew paint couldn't stop a determined corporation or a bad year of weather. But it was a line drawn in ink bigger than any one signature, a statement about who got to call this place home. He glanced at the military watch on his left wrist, the same one that had ticked away hours in deserts and jungles and lonely barracks. The hands moved steadily, unconcerned with maps or markets. "We stay," he said softly, mostly to Ranger, partly to the road that led out of town. The dog looked up at the sound of his voice, ears pricking, as if the 2 simple words were as clear a command as heel or sit. Walter felt a smile edge into his cheeks, not the tentative curve of earlier weeks, but something settled, like a man finally choosing a chair and making it his. That evening, as the sun slid down behind the silos and threw long, golden bars of light across the warehouse lot, Walter and Ranger walked their usual circuit along the fence line. The co-op building, once just a place he locked and unlocked, now felt different. A little more like a fort everyone owned together than a storeroom someone might quietly sell out from under them. Ranger paused at the back door they'd held against intruders not so long ago, sniffed once, then moved on, satisfied. Walter followed, the crunch of gravel under his boots a steady counterpoint to the rhythm of the dog's paws. The air smelled of cut hay, diesel, and the faint tang of fresh paint from the new sign up the road. He thought about the Stein's cooler full of milk, about the kids at the rescue training trying on courage like a new jacket, about the council's notice pinned where everyone could see it. He thought, too, about all the places he'd left before things were truly fixed. Ordered to move on, or convinced he wasn't the one to help. Here, for once, he had stayed long enough to see something bend the other way. Ranger brushed against his leg, not because there was danger, but because that was simply what he did when the light faded. Stay close. Keep the pack together. Walter rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling the solid warmth, the quiet, unquestioning readiness there. He knew the world wouldn't run out of storms, not for this town, not for any other. But as the day's last light slipped away and the first porch lamps blinked on up and down the street, he felt a calm he hadn't trusted in years, an understanding that wherever the next wind rose, he and the scarred shepherd at his side would meet it the same way they'd met this one. By showing up, standing firm, and remembering that being needed, in the end, was its own kind of homecoming. Sometimes God's miracles don't look like parted seas or thunder from the sky. Sometimes they look like an old soldier who refuses to sell out his neighbors, a scarred German shepherd who won't ignore the wrong smell, a small town that decides to stand together instead of giving up. If God can weave hope out of something as ordinary as a warehouse, a farm, and one tired veteran who simply stayed, then maybe he's still weaving quietly in our lives too. Through the choices we make, the people we protect, the land and family we refuse to abandon. So as you go back to your own every day, your kitchen table, your porch, your bills, your worries, may you remember, you are not invisible to God. He still uses ordinary hearts to hold the line for what is right. If this story touched you, would you share it with a friend who needs a little hope today? Leave a comment with the one moment that moved you most. And maybe a prayer request, if you'd like us to stand with you. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story of courage, faith, and second chances. And as you click away, I pray that the Lord watches over you and your loved ones, guards your home like Ranger guarded that door, and gently reminds you that you are still needed, still seen, and still deeply loved by Him, deeply.